So, like I said, my name is Derek Donaldson. I'm the HR supervisor here with Donnelly-Boland and Associates. So today's topic obviously is human resources. And the agenda for today's meeting, we're going to talk a little bit here about employees versus independent contractors. And then the bulk of the presentation is really going to talk about new hire paperwork and handbooks. And then we're also going to touch on some recruiting here at the end as well. So like Anna said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat there, and we'll try to get everything answered as we go through. So the first thing we're going to look at here is employees versus independent contractors, and just making sure you have your employees classified correctly. There's a lot of different factors that go into it, and we're going to walk through some of those here today. So we've actually, before we get into that one, I want to run through the chat here, and I want to ask a question. So let me see if I can get this pulled up. No, I don't see a poll question. All right, well, I am gonna just read you that question. So the first question we had today was, workers that are required to buy their own equipment and supplies are always independent contractors. So that's one of the questions that comes up a lot. And this is one of the key factors in determining an independent contractor. A lot of the times people will focus in on one individual aspect of that classification, and then they'll make a decision based on that. So a lot of times, a high majority of times, independent contractors do buy their own equipment, have their own supplies and everything. So while yes, that is likely the case, it's not always the case. So you never want to take these things as one individual factor when making a determination. So you want to factor in everything that goes into it and then make a decision. So independent contractors are self-employed. They're not covered by employment, labor, or tax-related laws, and they are subject to the self-employment tax. So in general, the rule is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or direct the result of the work. So that's a big thing that you'll see when making these determinations for independent contractors, is that it's the right to control. So independent contractor, a lot of the times, you as the employer only have the right to determine the project and when it needs to be done. So you control the result of the work, but not how that result gets done. So if you were going to hire Donnelly-Boland as an independent contractor to come in and do a file audit for you, we would come in, you would say, hey, you need to have this audit done by the end of the month. So then we have that control on our side of deciding how that gets done, what the time frame looks like. Maybe we want to do it for 2 hours every day until we get it done. Or maybe we want to do 2 12-hour days right at the end of the month to get everything done. So as long as that work gets done in the time frame that you lay out, that's kind of the end of the employer control there. So us as the independent contractor have the ability or the control to decide how everything goes. So some factors to consider: the permanency of the relationship. A lot of times independent contractors are going to be set periods of time or set projects that you're having people come in to complete. Workers' investment in facilities and equipment. Like I talked about previously, a lot of the times independent contractors are going to have their own equipment, even though it could be a separate company, have their own facilities, home offices, things like that. The hiring entities, nature and degree of control. Like I talked about in the last slide, control is the big thing. You're going to look more as an independent contractor. If you're coming in, you're controlling all the individual aspects of the day-to-day work, just not that outcome. And the worker's opportunity for profit and loss, and the amount of initiative, judgment, or foresight in an open market competition with others. So profit and loss is going to be us as Donnelly-Boland. We could decide to have one person out there, certain number of days and hours, or we could have 3 or 4 people out there and get things done a lot faster. So we have that opportunity to put more manpower towards it which could affect the profit and loss. Open market competition is looking more for bids. A lot of times you can put out bids for an independent contractor to complete a project. So that's the open market competition there. So the next thing we're going to look at here is new hire paperwork. And we're going to start here with the onboarding, some of the must-haves, best practice, and good to have sections or options within the onboarding process in the new hire paperwork that you collect on all your employees. So must-haves, you're going to look at I-9, W-4, EIT form. So the I-9, probably the most important form, which verifies that the employee is legally able to work in the United States. We're going to go into a lot more detail on the I-9s here later in the presentation, because this is something that we get a lot of questions on, and something that we do as Donnelly-Boland provide is I-9 audits. And then the W-4 and EIT form, those are local federal taxes. So obviously making sure all of those are paid for your employee and paid correctly to the right local and federal. Best practice offer letter is the first one. You really should have this for every employee. It's important that all employees understand not only their title, their hourly rate, their work location, their supervisor benefits. There's a lot of different things that go into an offer letter that's important to have, so an employee understands, what's expected of them. Job description. Job descriptions are also very important. Employees should be signing off on all job descriptions, and they need to be relative to the job. It's not a situation where I can just go out and Google search HR generalist job description and then use that for my company. While a lot of those things that may come up on that would be applicable, there's going to be a lot that aren't as well, because each company is slightly different in their expectations of what that position will do. So you may be able to Google search and find that, use that as a template, but you also want to tailor that individually to what you expect to get out of that employee. Handbook receipt, handbook in general. All companies should have an employee handbook, and then you should have a receipt on that. So you pretty much, if you have an employee handbook, which everybody should, you should have a sign-off page at the end of that handbook that all employees are acknowledging receipt. It's just something that helps hold them accountable for things that are within that handbook, and something that the company can use kind of to fall back on, which we'll talk about more later here in the presentation. But it allows the company to fall back on those things when anytime going through an unemployment or an EEOC claim, things like that. Finally, under the best practice, we have emergency contacts. Obviously, you need to know who to contact if there's ever an emergency for any of your employees. Good to have here in the column on the right, we have application and resume. Obviously important to have, because you want to understand background and things as you're onboarding people. References. References are something that I've seen recently kind of become less and less important. I think, me personally, not a big fan of references, just because there's not too many candidates out there that can't find 3 people to give them a good reference. Someone's not going to provide somebody who's going to say, hey, they never showed up for work, they're a terrible employee. And obviously you have an idea as a candidate on who's going to give you a good reference, and those are the people you're going to list. So sometimes those can be hit or miss. Direct deposit form. So if you allow direct deposits, you want to have a direct deposit form that the employee is signing off on. You also want to make sure you're getting a voided check or something from the bank verifying that account. Acknowledgement forms. So the acknowledgement forms are sometimes they're policies within the handbook. Sometimes they're additional policies that have been added but not put into the handbook yet. So this could be PTO policy, some type of benefit policies, company property, technology use, anything like that you can get sign-off sheets for. I can tell you here personally at DBA, we recently, at the beginning of last year, changed our PTO policy. And obviously we didn't update our handbook at that time as well. So we had sent the policy out and we had an acknowledgement form for each employee to sign off on, saying that they understand it. So sometimes that can be policies within the handbook, but sometimes it can be new policies that haven't yet made it in there. Clearances. So clearances, this is going to be really company specific, depending on what you guys are required to do under contracts. So internally here, everybody is required to have Act 33, Act 34, which is going to be your criminal and child line clearance. A lot of our employees are required because of our contractual obligations to have an FBI clearance. We have some clients that are also have additional clearances, mandated reporter, things like that. So this is really company specific there on what clearances you should have. Transcripts. If you have a position that requires a higher education level, so bachelor's degree, master's, doctorate, whatever that may be, you want to make sure that you're collecting transcripts, at minimum a diploma. But it's important that you verify education levels, especially if it's required under a contract that you have. So I can give you an example that we went through a while back now with an employee who came on, was required to have a bachelor's degree. They said they had their bachelor's degree. They're actually in the process of getting their master's. So they onboarded them. They were a good candidate. And one of the things we asked for was transcripts. And the employee, weeks in now, still wasn't able to provide the transcripts. So we had to set a hard deadline of, hey, we need to have it by this date, or, we can't employ you any longer. And it turned out that employee had some outstanding issues with the school and never actually received his diploma for his undergraduate. And he was working towards his master's, but technically didn't have that bachelor's degree yet. And he wasn't able to obtain it in the time frame that we gave it. So we had to let them go. So definitely important, if those education levels are required, that you collect transcripts, something verifying that the employee or candidate has it. Driver's information. This is going to be if you, not only for company cars, but if an employee travels for work, you should have driver's information for them. Driver's license, driver's record check, auto insurance, and you should make sure that all of those are up to date. That auto insurance can be a pain, as a lot of auto insurances renew every 6 months, but it's important to have on file if your employees are driving for work. Finally, there's credentials. So we have a social services company that we work with, and they're all required to be CPR certified. So we have copies of their CPR certifications on file. Donnelly-Boland is a CPA company, so we have CPA licenses on file. So any type of credentials like that are required for your individual positions, you should make sure you have a copy of those on file.
And Derek, quickly before you move on, we have a good question in the Q&A pod, but please let us know if you are planning to dive a little bit more into I-9 forms in coming slides. But somebody asked, what do I do for I-9 if the person I'm hiring is fully remote? Can they just scan documents and email them?
Yes. So that is a good question, and it is something that I'm going to actually dive into here later in the presentation when we get into I-9s, because there is a caveat going on right now with COVID and the pandemic. On the Department of Homeland Security recently just extended companies' ability to virtually verify documents. So definitely something I'll get into later. And if I don't get that question fully answered, feel free to ask any follow-ups at that time. So personnel files, this is just a list of some of the things that should be kept in your personnel files: any investigations, write-ups, evals, information changes, so name changes, address changes, benefit forms, workers' comp. Obviously, this list is not all inclusive, all the new hire paperwork, acknowledgements. There's a lot of different things that go into an employee's personnel file, but that's just a list of a few of them. So proper documentation. So from the moment you make an offer, your organization's focus should be on documentation, and that should start right from the recruiting, where recruiting starts for candidates, of collecting resumes and then applications and then notes from your interview processes, everything along those lines. You want to start documenting right away. So file keeping and legal compliance doesn't have to be a burden. So if you start right from the beginning, it's a lot easier to stay up to date than trying to backtrack retroactively to make sure files are up to date and you have everything that you need. So setting up your files properly can improve the efficiency and reduce your legal risk. So proper documentation is an employer's greatest weapon in any type of claim, whether that be unemployment, EEOC, and I'll talk about that here in a minute here on the next slide. So why documentation is so important and why is detail so important? So unemployment claims, EEOC claims, and lawsuits are the three main things that we see there. So unemployment, probably the most common. Obviously, anytime an employee is terminated, you'll get an unemployment paperwork to complete and submit. And if you want to fight that paperwork, it's important that you have this backup documentation to show, what policy they violated, why they were terminated. And this is why handbooks are so important to be up to date. Job descriptions need to be up to date, and the documentation of any disciplinary process, everything needs to be detailed. So if something like this comes up, it's a lot easier for you to submit this paperwork and say, hey, this is our process for tardies, 10 tardies and you're terminated. Here are the 10 days that they were late and they were terminated. It's a lot easier to fight a case when you have defined policies in your handbook, and then you're also following through with those policies. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we start talking about handbooks. So now we're going to talk about the I-9, just like the question that asked here a few minutes ago. Hopefully get into a little more detail here on the I-9 and kind of explain some of those caveats now with COVID. So what is the I-9? Why is it so important? The I-9 is a form that is required by all United States workers to verify that they are eligible to work in the United States. Right now, PA does have an electronic site that you can run these through. It's called E-Verify. Currently not mandatory in PA unless you are a federal contractor, but we use that here internally for our DBA employees. It's just something that is a little easier, quicker, and something to pass that information along to the government. So let me try this poll question here again. So poll question 2. So an I-9 form for an employee hired on January 18th, 2021 and terminated on May 18th, 2022 is required to be retained until what date? So I'm going to give everybody a couple seconds here to read that question and throw your answer in there, and then we'll talk about the answer. All right. So it looks like it was answers varied there. 50% on January 18th, 2024, 17% January 18th, 2023, and 33% May 18th, 2025. So the correct answer there is going to be January 18th, 2024. So I-9 files are required to be kept for 3 years from your date of hire or 1 year from your date of termination, whichever is longer. So in this specific situation, if the employee was hired January 18th, 2021, 3 years would be January 18th, 2024. And the termination date was May 18th of 22, which 1 year from termination would be May 18th, 2023. Obviously, the later of those two dates is going to be January 18th, 2024. So we're going to get into this a little bit later. I want to talk about an article that I read recently, just a few months ago, about an employer who, let me share those results, sorry. An employer had operations in Washington and Oregon, so on the West Coast there. And they were just recently fined this year over $1.5 million for I-9 violations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that article and also walk through some of the mistakes that they made that they were fined for. So let's get into some of those top employer mistakes first. So some of the main issues that we see when we're coming into companies and doing our I-9 audits is that employers are not reviewing Section 1 after they're completed by new employees. So employees often forget to sign or forget the date or forget to check boxes in Section 1 that they're required to complete. So a lot of times employers just flip right to Section 2 that they're required to do and complete that section. So you're going to make sure you complete or review Section 1 to make sure the employee completed everything accurately. So accepting unacceptable or fraudulent documents. So obviously, if you have a good fake ID, you may not catch that. What they're looking for here is really blatant fraudulent documents that you're accepting. If you have a social security card that has social security spelled wrong, or if you have a ID that says Babe Ruth birth date 1909, things like that that are just blatantly fraudulent. That's what more they're looking for in those situations. So not recording the document title, issuing authority, or expiration date, or recording it incorrectly. So section 2, which is required to be completed by the employer, issuing authority, expiration date, and title are all in that section. So issuing authority, one of the things that we most commonly see errors here is with the Social Security card. A lot of times employers will just write Social Security Administration for the issuing authority, but there are actually 3 different issuing authorities that can publish the Social Security cards. So you want to make sure you're not just assuming it's the Social Security Administration. And where you see this is on the middle of your Social Security card. It is written in a circle right in the middle. So it's a place to look to verify what that actual issuing authority is. Making corrections without initialing or dating them. We'll talk a little bit more about this later when we talk about self audits in the I-9. But the Department of Homeland Security is very specific, and they have a procedure on how corrections within the I-9 should be made. So it's not, you can't just scratch things out on the I-9 and write it next to it. So one of the things that you can do is you put a line through it and then initial and date next to it. I would recommend, if it's on section 2 and you're able to, just print out a new copy and recomplete the form. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a couple slides. So employers not listing the date of hire or signing and dating in section 2. So this is the bottom of section 2 that the employer is required to complete. Sometimes they'll complete the information at the top but not sign or not date, or sign but not print. Pretty much just not fully completing that section 2 there. So I-9 important details for employers. So the I-9 must be completed within 3 days of hire. So if you have an employee who started on Monday of this week, if you don't have their I-9 documentation completed, you would have had to send them home this morning. So they're no longer able to work until you receive those documents. And we've had this come up, unfortunately, a few times over the 10 years that I've been here. So not a common occurrence, but it has happened where we've had to send people home on day 4 because they didn't provide us with the information we needed. So employers cannot specify which documents they will accept from an employee. The I-9 has a list of all acceptable documents that is part of that PDF form that you can print off, and you cannot specify which forms you will accept from the employee. The most common things you're going to see document wise is if you're doing document A, it's going to be a passport. And if you do document B and C, you're going to be most likely looking at Social Security card and driver's license, but you have to accept anything that is listed on the acceptable document list. Employers may, but are not required to photocopy the documents. And if photocopies are made, they should be made for all employees and re-verifications. This should be done 100% of the time, in my opinion. It really is the best practice, and it does nothing but help protect the company by making these photocopies and keeping it with the I-9 document. And finally, their independent contractors do not need to complete the I-9 form. That's just circling back to the employee versus independent contractor. So employer responsibilities. So employees must complete section 1 no later than their first day of work. So the section 1 of the I-9 needs to be completed by the employer no later than day 1. It can be completed prior to the start, but day 1 at the latest. Section 2 must be completed by the employer or authorized representative within 72 hours from their hire date, which is what we just talked about. And you must physically examine the documents. Now, going back to the question that came up in the Q&A section, there was a COVID exemption when the pandemic hit that allowed employers to verify documents remotely or through Zoom. So that was recently just extended. So I believe last month in April, the Department of Homeland Security extended that COVID exemption through October 31st of this year. So what that really means is if you have employees who are temporarily remote because of COVID, then you can verify their documentation for the I-9 virtually, but you are still required, once they return to the office or normal duties, that you verify the actual physical documents within 3 days of that time. So if you have someone who is in the office right now, you can't verify virtually in that situation. So you would still need to get those hard copies. It's really for temporarily remote employees because of COVID related reasons.
Derek, does this not apply to then fully remote employees that have never been temporarily, on a temporary basis at home, they were hired on fully remote?
So there's a couple different things that you can do. One of the things that we've done is we have a client that has 100% remote employees, and they are across the state. And what they do there is they have it done by a notary. So they have to take it to a notary and get it verified.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and then the person that completes section 2 has to be the same person that verified the documents. So you can't have one person verify the document and then somebody else complete the I-9 form. Whoever verifies those documents should be the person completing section 2. So like I talked about here a little bit earlier is acceptable ID documents. List A is the most common thing you're going to see there is a passport. And then from list B and C is the driver's license and social security card. But again, you have to accept anything that's on the list. So audits. You can have a outside company come in and audit your I-9 files, something that we do here at Donnelly-Boland for some of our clients. But you can also do what's called a self-audit. And what that is just you reviewing your own files for mistakes and making those corrections. Like I said, Department of Homeland Security has a procedure on how different sections and different errors within the I-9 form are, excuse me, are required to be corrected. So to give you an example of that, we did an I-9 audit for a client a few years ago now, but we came in, smaller client, only had 30 or so employees. And we reviewed the file, and they probably had about 15 errors of the 30 employees, all small errors, signatures, dates, check boxes, things like that. So what we had to do is we followed obviously the Department of Homeland Security's guidelines on how those were corrected. In some cases, it was just a strike through initial and date next to it. Some we had to complete a whole new I-9 form for. And then, obviously keep it with you. Should never get rid of the original I-9. Even if you make a correction and complete a whole new one, they should be kept together, and it should be noted why those changes were made. So in the file audit that I was talking about, since there were so many, we pretty much wrote a letter and signed off on it explaining all of these changes. So it just said, on this date, Donnelly-Boland and Associates conducted an I-9 audit and the following mistakes were found and corrected. We signed off on it. They now keep that in their I-9 binder. So if they get audited, they can show that, hey, they had this outside company come in, they reviewed, these are the errors they found, these are the corrections they made, and then going forward, they can show that they're now completing those I-9 forms correctly. So that's not to say if they got audited, they wouldn't catch any fines, but if you can show that good faith effort of you found errors, you made corrections, you changed your procedures here to make sure those things don't happen again, that goes a long way. So you may be thinking now, how much are we talking here when it comes down to these fines? So individual paperwork and technical violations, so that missing signatures, dates, can range from $250 to over $2,500. Fines for knowingly hiring and continuing to employ unauthorized workers range from over $600 to over $5,000 per error. And it gets higher for repeat offenders. Department of Homeland Security, I believe, has a first-time offender, second-time offender, third-time offender list. So those fines can get up there pretty quick if you get into those multiple offender lists. So these numbers here are just updated actually in January of this year. And then the last thing I want to talk about here on this slide, some of you may be thinking that, this probably wouldn't apply to me as a smaller employer. So what I want to do is talk about that article that I had mentioned earlier. So in January of this year, an administrative law judge found that a company who had operations in Washington and Oregon violated I-9 requirements, and they fined them over $1.5 million. So this company was a staffing company, but they had less than 50 full-time regular employees. They did have hundreds of seasonal employees at various times throughout the year, but only 50 or less than 50 regular full-time employees. So ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they were tipped off that this company was not following I-9 procedures. So they did an investigation. After the initial investigation, they were looking to fine over $2 million for their I-9 violations. Eventually, after they went to court there with the administrative law judge, that fine was determined to be over $1.5 million that they were fined. So I want to talk about some of the things and the errors that they made. In the article, it lists some of the different mistakes. So failing to timely prepare and present requested I-9 forms, including failure to produce the full form. So they had blank pages or just completely missing I-9 forms for individual employees. So obviously this is the most egregious of the fines that they have. So no category of employment authorization designation in section 1. So that's the employee section where they check that they're authorized to work in the United States. So that all this is they forgot a checkbox. No signature on the new hire line in section 1. So the employee forgot to sign. No document entries in section 2 or entries for invalid documents. So they either left the top part of section 2 blank, or they accepted documents that weren't on the accepted document list. So no or only partial document numbers or expiration dates. So they didn't have the full document number. So if you had the Social Security card, maybe they only had the last 4 instead of the full Social Security number. No printed name or employer's representative in section 2. So they didn't complete the second part of the employer section. No compliance signature of employer's representative. So in this situation, they noted here that they used a signature stamp. So all I-9 forms need to have wet signatures on it by the employee or verified electronic, and then the employer. So in this situation, they used a stamp for an employee signature instead of wet sign. No employer attestation in section 2 confirming the employer reviewed the documents. So again, this is that second section of section 2 where the employer verifies that they reviewed the documents. Failing to complete I-9 form within the time required. So this is the 72 hours that we talked about. So they were completing forms after that time frame and not noting anything in there. And the last thing was failing to re-verify employment authorization. So this is something that when you complete an I-9, you are able, if somebody leaves and comes back within 3 years, you're able to re-verify that I-9 instead of doing a whole new one. Now you still can do a whole new one if you would choose to, but you need to do one or the other, either a new form or you need to re-verify the current form. So in this situation, they didn't do that. So they brought someone back that was within 3 years, didn't have them do a new I-9 form and didn't re-verify the one that they had previously. So a lot of different errors, but besides the completely missing pages and missing I-9 documentations, a lot of those are minor errors. So obviously, if you have hundreds of seasonal employees that you're making those errors for, that can obviously rack up your fine. But again, that's a company of less than 50 full-time regular employees that was fined over $1.5 million just 4 or 5 months ago. So retaining I-9 forms, we talked a little bit about this in the polling question. An employee's I-9 form should be stored separately from personnel files in a secure location. And there should be I-9 files for active and terminated employees. So you have one for current employees, and then as they terminate, you move them to a termination binder is a best practice. So what we do here is we have a termination binder for all of our I-9 files. We put a post-it note on that I-9 form when we move it to that binder that has the date that we can shred it at. And then we keep that binder in chronological order. We try to check it every once in a while, shred all the forms we don't need, just to make sure that we're in compliance and we're keeping them as long as we need to. If an employee is rehired within 3 years from the date that his or her previous I-9 form was completed, you don't have to do a new one. That's what we talked about. You can re-verify, but you do have that option to complete a whole new form. I-9 forms need to be retained for 1 year after termination, 3 years after your date of hire. Again, that's what we talked about in our polling question.
And really quickly, Derek, before you move on, we might be backtracking just a little bit, but we had a good question in the Q&A pod. Can you reiterate if a digital signature is acceptable for a new hire or not?
Yeah. So we've done a little bit, and I have to verify all the regulations on that because I'm not 100% sure on the digital signature in the relation to the COVID exemptions. But if we want to get that information, we can verify that and get back to you. I don't want to give any wrong information.
If they, if this person, they did answer anonymously. So if you would like to drop your email or anything like that, please do so in the chat pod. But also remember that we will be showing Derek's contact information at the end of this and with the follow-up email. So we can get back to you that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can just reach out to me directly and we can verify that. All right. So the last polling question here, I'm going to throw up here and launch. Okay, so this polling question is, how often should you review and update your company handbook? Give it a couple more seconds here. All right, we're going to end that, share those results. So 43% said 1 year, 14% at 2 years, and 43% at 5 years. So best practice is 1 year. So every year you should be reviewing your company handbook, both for internal policy changes and for external regulatory changes. So sometimes, obviously, that's best practice. It's tough to do that. It's a lot to do on an annual basis, but the best practice for that is annually. Okay, and now let's get into the employee handbooks. So employee handbooks, the purpose, I know I'm going to try and jump through this pretty quickly here. We only got 15 minutes left. So the purpose of the handbook is really to be a resource, not only for your employees, but for the company as well. It's something that the company can rely on, fall back on, and show employees, why maybe a disciplinary process happened or how things should be treated and the procedures for different things within your company. Also limits legal liability. Like I said, this is something, having clearly defined policies can help against discrimination claims. So it's obviously important to have that clear policy, but it's even more important that you follow that policy consistently. So you don't want a policy talking about tardies and it just says, you need to show up to work on time, or excessive tardies will receive disciplinary action. Me as a supervisor, maybe I think excessive is 1 to 2 times a month, where another supervisor may think 1 to 2 times a week. You want to make sure that your policies are clear enough that they can be followed consistently by all supervisors. So a few tips on employee handbooks is use language all employees will understand. You want to kind of stay away from legal jargon when you're putting together a handbook. Employees need to be able to read it and understand it. Use the handbook as a resource for the employer as well as the employees. Maintain and update as necessary, ideally once a year, like we talked about. Have a table of contents. Nothing more frustrating as an employee if you come in to try to find something in a handbook that's 100 pages long and there's no table of contents, you don't know where to start. Have electric and hard copies available to employees. So you want to have that electronic that you can send out whenever someone may ask for it. But you also want to provide them a hard copy if needed. And then have employees sign and submit a receipt. We talked about that earlier in documentation. All employees should be signing off that they read, that they understand that they're responsible for everything within that company handbook. So 3 C's of handbooks for small business owners: compliance, communication, and consistency. Compliance is obviously all your regulatory, everything that you're required to follow as a company. Communication, you got to be clear with your employees, not only within the handbook, but as things change with your handbook, you want to make sure that you're supplying that updated handbook to everyone. If it's not in there, like I talked about earlier with the policy that we recently added, provide it to them, have them sign off on it. Employees need to have a clear understanding when things are changing. And then most importantly is consistency. You got to treat everyone equally within your policies. So you got to make sure your supervisors are trained to do that as well. And they understand the handbook, the procedures, how things work. So you can fall back on that. Like I said, unemployment, EEOC, unemployment claims. I can't tell you how many times we've submitted handbook receipts and policies to fight unemployment. EEOC claims the same way. Someone files a claim through the EEOC of discrimination, we can fall back on our handbook and say, hey, this is our policy. We followed this to a T. This is the sign-off sheet showing this employee understood this policy. So it's very important to not only have the compliance and communication, but also be consistent with it. Some handbook must-haves: an at-will disclaimer. So Pennsylvania is an at-will state. So it's important you have to have that in there. Acknowledgement of the receipt, which we've talked about a few times now. The EEOC policy, so the Equal Employment Opportunity Policy. Anti-harassment, anti-discrimination. Employee classification. So this is just going to be all the different types of employees: exempt, non-exempt, contract. Employee benefits. You don't need to be, it doesn't have to be a benefit summary of every benefit that you offer, but a brief rundown of the different benefits that you offer should be in there. And then employee job details. This is going to be more pay schedule, pay periods, dress codes, PTO policies, attendance policies, different stuff like that that relates directly to that employee's job details. Employee handbooks here: handbook, federal and state laws. So you're looking FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act. That's your exempt, non-exempt, overtime. ADA, Americans with Disabilities. It's reasonable accommodations. COBRA and FMLA. COBRA, you may, if you don't qualify for regular COBRA, you may qualify for mini COBRA. FMLA is one of the more common ones people see. It only affects employers of 50 or more. But these are 4 main ones to review, make sure you're in compliance with if they're if you have to abide by them. And the final section here is recruiting. So I just want to briefly walk through recruiting and the recruiting process. So determining the type of hire that you're looking for. So you want to look at this. Are you looking for full-time? You're looking for part-time? Job descriptions. Are your job descriptions up to date? One of the main things you see in recruiting is the worst thing is to bring somebody on board. You went through all the interviews, everything like that. You onboarded, you're training them, and it comes back, they quit because the job isn't what they thought it was. So having a clear job description can help prevent that. Advertising and sourcing. So where are you going to post these positions? Are you going to post it on Indeed? Are you going to do LinkedIn? Are you going to do a job fair? How are you going to go about that process? Screening and interviewing, that's applicants coming in after you're posting, reviewing them, scheduling interviews, making an offer, and then finally onboarding. So that's where it kind of transitions from the recruiting side into the employment side there when you get to the onboarding. So we're going to talk about those a little bit. Types of hiring. So you have permanent, so that's full-time or part-time, exempt, non-exempt, but just a permanent employee. Temp to perm, which is just a temporary employment with the possibility of permanent employment after that. And then temporary or contract employment. Developing the job description. So this needs to, like I said, accurately reflect the core roles and responsibilities. Employees need to know, candidates need to understand what's going to be required of them coming in. So clearly indicate any requirements of the position. So we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about documentation and new hire paperwork there with credentials, education requirements. You need to make sure that those are clear in your job description so an employee knows if they're even qualified for the position they're looking to fill. Advertising and sourcing, there's proactive and reactive sourcing. The most common thing companies are doing is reactive sourcing, which is just posting your job on LinkedIn or Indeed, waiting for those references to come in to review them and start that process. Proactive sourcing is where you go out through LinkedIn or Indeed messaging and you direct message employees that maybe didn't apply for your job, but you've reviewed their resume and you think they could be a good fit. So it's much more targeted, specialized approach is that proactive side. So screening and interviewing, best practice to screen applicants before scheduling interviews. So this avoids the fallout later in the interview process by being transparent and preventing wasting time on interviews. So if you have a hard salary is the most common one we see. If you're not going to be able to go over $45,000 and you call someone who applied, the resume look good, they're looking for $60,000. If there's no wiggle room there, there's no point of bringing that person in. So it's important to do that. I can't tell you before we started doing this, how many times we would bring somebody in for a $40,000 position and they were looking for 70. And that didn't come out until that first interview. So that pre-screen for an interview is very important just to kind of hammer out some of those early details. So typically when you're doing those pre-employment or pre-interview calls, you're not only doing salary, but you're verifying work location, schedule. We have a client that they have trouble filling the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, which is obviously a hard shift to fill. So that's something that we verify with them when we are reviewing candidates for that specific shift. And then just required experience, education, and verify things like that that are required. You want to make sure you get all that information out of the way. It's much easier to do in a 10-15 minute phone call than to get 3 or 4 of your employees together to do an interview and find out in that interview. And then the final one here is just making an offer. So when you present an offer to a candidate, you're looking to get a verbal acceptance from the candidate that they accept, and it's commonplace to allow them 24 to 48 hours to give an official acceptance. So that's what you're doing during that pre-screen phone call, is kind of walking through all those things like that I listed right there. And this one also includes, vacation and benefits and their start date. Most people need to give at least 2 weeks before they start, but depending on the industry, that may be different. And it also gives you a little time there for counters or negotiations where sometimes a candidate may say, okay, I would accept this, but I need this salary or this number of vacation days. So there's a conversation there of, getting that to that next level of getting that final approval and agreement, not only from the company, but the candidate that's going to accept that position. And then after that, that's when you get into the onboarding of you getting the job offer letter that we talked about. Again, a lot of the same information going out at that time, but that will move out of the recruiting side. So I think that is the last slide we have there. The final slide is just any questions. So we'll open that up and see if Anna has anything additional.
Yeah, we have just a couple more minutes. I know that we're almost at 10 a.m., but we do have a few more minutes to hang around and answer any questions you guys might have. We don't have any more in the chat pod currently, but please feel free, even if it's, it feels specific to your organization or situation, please still feel free to ask it right now. We have the time to, and just a couple last minute items. If anybody needs to get out of here now, we're going to be sending a follow-up email either today or tomorrow that will have a survey linked for you guys to take. And this is just for feedback on these types of webinars, how you think we did. If you think Derek did an amazing, awesome job and you are now an expert in HR too, or, some other topics that you might be interested in that you hope we will cover in the near future. We do look at those very thoroughly and take them into account when we're doing our future webinar planning. It will also have the link for this video in it if you would like to watch it back, if you feel like you missed any parts. And then we also have a link for a Google review for us. If you think we did a great job and you're liking what we do so far, please feel free to review us on Google. And then obviously contact information if you have any follow-up questions for Derek or us, that will be on there as well. Okay, so I have one question in here now. How tough, this is definitely for you, Derek, how tough has staffing been for your organization? I've had a lot of trouble with my business.
Sure. So I can talk about that a little bit. So it's been tough for everybody, regardless of industry right now. Our recruitment supervisor a few months ago was giving a presentation where he's talking about recruiting specifically for us in accounting. And he said the unemployment rate right now for accountants is 0. So he pretty much said, if you're an accountant in Pittsburgh right now, if you don't have a job, it's because you don't want to work. So just everything right now is very tough for employers, because that's most aren't 0, but the unemployment there is low for everybody across the board. And a lot of times, if you need to fill a position, you're taking that person from another job. It's not that most people aren't out there unemployed that are coming in looking for a job. Your incentives need to be high enough, your salary needs to be high enough, your benefits need to be good enough to pull someone away from a job that they already have. So the business right now is definitely tough. Like I said, we've had trouble with that. I think everybody has. It's been a lot harder. A lot of people want remote work. And if you can't offer that, that's a detriment as well. We posted a job for over a month and got 2 applicants, I believe, and then changed it to remote, and we got about 30 applicants in a week. So that's how important remote work is to employees. Now, some of those were employees out of state that really we weren't really interested in, but a full month of 2 to 1 week of 30, it's wild how much that can change. So if that is something that you do offer, you want to make sure you're getting that in your job postings so candidates see that.
Do a couple, maybe another minute or 2 in here. If anybody has any last minute questions or thoughts. But thank you everybody for coming. Really, I think we had a great turnout today, and that we had a lot of great questions and input. And I know that, we've had a lot of Zoom webinars at this point, so we're always really grateful when people take time out of their mornings during the week to come and stay with us for an hour and, learn a little bit more. So we really do appreciate it. And thank you, Derek, too. We appreciate you as well.
Happy to do it. Hope I lived up to the hype there.
I think you did too. I think everybody else should be giving you a 5-star, but okay. All right, we will start kind of filtering out now. I don't have any more questions at the moment, so I'm going to be ending this here shortly. So again, thank you everybody, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thanks everybody.